In the last video, we talked about how you would slice and dice your user stories. Now it's time to get your user stories development ready. And when we say development ready, we mean that a developer should be able to take up your story and start cracking code. So let's talk about what goes into a developable user story, if there's a term such as that. So first things first, your story needs to have a title and a goal. And as we've said before, we follow the format as a user. I want to do something so that I achieve a goal. That's the format that we usually would like to follow. Now, admittedly, you're not going to follow this for all of your career, but if this is new to you, it's a good idea to follow that format. Next, you have acceptance criteria, and we'll shortly show you what acceptance criteria look like. But essentially, they are a list of preconditions, actions, and expected behavior for the capability that you're providing from the user story. You might need to provide wireframes and mockups, especially if this is user-facing functionality. You also will need to provide, if necessary, technical or testing notes, especially if you've had conversations with developers that have certain nuances that need to be captured as part of the whole implementation of the story. And remember, one of the big things about user stories is that they are what we call placeholders for conversations.
Yes.
And given that they are placeholders for a conversation, a big anti-pattern is to not record the conversation. Because a user story has a huge life. You know, you might talk about a user story in an inception, but get to develop it maybe 4 weeks later. And there's a lot of conversations that happen in the middle. You could have a conversation with the stakeholder about what they want to achieve. You can have a conversation with developers about, you know, what might be technical limitations you encounter. And then eventually scope changes because the stakeholder has a little bit of a different idea about the scope. So all of that information usually should be captured inside the user story. And the great thing is most modern tools allow you to have that history either through comments or versioning. So make sure you keep a track of all of that information.
Right. And these are just the various sections that we recommend. But usually we do understand that create a version of a story that works well for you and your team. I think that is one of the major testing aspects of a story. So there is no set format. So don't take this as a Bible, but make sure all of these components are there and do figure out if it whatever format works well for your team.
Yep. And so we talked about acceptance criteria. Richard is going to tell us how to write acceptance criteria.
Right. I think acceptance criteria is important because that's what tells us if a story is done or not, right? Whether the story is complete or not, which is why it is called an acceptance criteria. So let's talk about Ishmi, who's 25 years old, works in an IT firm, frequently bangs online and manages multiple accounts. And the story that we're detailing out is that he wants to view his accounts. So as an online banking customer, I want to view the list of a list of all my accounts so that I can select one to view more details, right? So as Sumit mentioned earlier, Ishmit is an online banking customer. The story is that he wants to view a list of all of my accounts. And so that he can do the next step, which is to view more details. Now, again, the next stories, we don't want to do everything in a single story. So if you see, the context is basically that, the blob that you see here, I will not repeat that. But also it talks about the dependency, which is that order list by price story is actually dependent on viewing the accounts, because only then you can talk about prices.
Yeah. And this will probably rock you back to the stuff that we talked about when we did our story splitting tutorial. My handwriting is really bad, but I wrote story splitting there. So yeah, we've split stories here in the and split the dependencies, but that's probably because this story, if we included all the dependencies in, would have made the whole story too big to handle. Plus, it provides independent value. Just being able to select one of my accounts or being able to view a list of my accounts, that by itself provides independent value.
Yeah.
Okay, so I can quickly explain what the format of acceptance criteria can look like. Again, this is not the only format, but a format that we recommend you start with just until you get the hang of writing acceptance criteria. And there are three parts to it. You describe the precondition. So you say, given a precondition, when a certain event occurs, and that event could be user interaction, that event could be a system event that actually happens in the background, then ensure certain outcomes. And Richard can show you a couple of examples of that.
Right. And so again, going back to our story, as an online banking customer, I want to view a list of all of my accounts so that I can select one to view more details. Now here, one of the ACs would be, given the customer, in our case, Ishmit, has one or more transaction accounts, when they have logged in, so we only want him to see their accounts after they log in, the screen should show the names and numbers of the accounts sorted in the account number order. So here it very well talks about if this is not happening, that means a story is not done. So it talks about what is the precondition that the customer should have accounts. When an event occurs, here the event that is happening is that he's logging in. And then is basically what should happen, which is in this case, we should see the names and numbers of the account sorted in a certain order. Now, this particular format really helps us thinking about various scenarios and gets us thinking, which is very powerful. And we can talk about the alternate scenario. Now, think about another scenario where he has more than 20 transaction accounts. Right. So in that case, that is the precondition. We can't show all of the 20 accounts in one single page. So then the event remains the same. Whereas when they have completed logging in, then display the first 20 accounts. And then the rest of the accounts should be viewed in a paginated list. So here we are introducing the concept of pagination, where you will again talk about more than 20 transaction accounts. Now, there could be ways where you could say, hey, we don't want that. There is never going to be that scenario where a customer would have 20 accounts. But this format helps you think in a way that what if this was the case, at least have that conversation with your stakeholders, whether this is even a possibility, right? So you may decide not to do this, but if yes, then your ACs would look something like this. Let's look at another example. So here we want to consider what a happy path is, what is a sad path, or what is an alternative path.
Yeah, and just to add to what Richard was saying, the previous examples that we talked about the happy path, right? Because the user is successfully logged in. But the sad path is, what if it's not successful, right? What if there is an error? And the alternative path, we'll see an example of that in a short while.
Yeah, so here, let's say the alternative path is where I've closed all my accounts and I have no accounts. Now, when I complete logging in, we don't want to be in a state where everything is blank and nothing is happening. So in that case, we want to show a message that, hey, no accounts are available. And that's why you're seeing a blank page. Now, that is another criteria, which is an alternative path. A sad path could look something like this, where you have some accounts, but there was an error. Like, when you've completed logging in and the system cannot retrieve any accounts because there was a server error somewhere, then you should show an error message to the user so that they know something is wrong with the system. Another tip is get familiar with all of the system errors that can occur. It is extremely useful to have that conversation with the developers and ask yourself those questions. Going back to when we were talking about splitting stories, I just want to talk about, so Sumit, if you could go back to the paginated list example. In worst cases where we talked about vertical slicing, when we are unable to do that, let's say, and the story was immensely big, the way I would split it is with splitting the acceptance criteria. So maybe I could say, hey, what if I take our pagination out into a separate story, and the rest of the story remains the same. So I'm still not slicing it horizontally, but I am still slicing it vertically. In the worst possible case, I'm actually slicing by the acceptance criteria. So my invest principle remains the same.
Yeah. So as we were saying, in invest, we say we want to keep our story small. Yeah. And if we see too many acceptance criteria coming in, which makes the story too big, then that's how we choose to slice. Right. So this is the small, if it wasn't evident already, the small of the invest.
Right. Again, repeating, we're not prescribing a standard structure to write stories, but this is a general structure which has proven to be useful when in thinking and coming up with different scenarios that could occur.
Yeah, and look, you might develop muscle memory and start writing this in a different format. If that works for you, great. But for all practical purposes, if you're looking for a framework to get started, this is a framework that you can use.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the end of the segment on detailing your requirements. And I think this is going to be the bread and butter of what you do as an Agile analyst, especially on your first project. So do give the assignment that we've created a shot, because that'll give you a fair amount of confidence on how you detail requirements for your team. And once you've done that, you can move on to the next segment in this course.
And get feedback.
Yes, definitely for this segment, please get feedback from your colleagues and potentially somebody else who's got a little bit of experience doing business analysis in an Agile environment. And I think that feedback will stand you in good stead.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next video.
Yes.